Hello and welcome to Halloween Eve. I thought it'd be kind of fun to play this record live from Cadaver Records, the Vampire, A Tale by John William Polidori. I don't know much about this. It seemed cool at the time, so let's try it out. I don't know how long it'll last. Hopefully I won't get stopped or whatever the hell, but I don't know. Seemed cool at the time. Perfect timing for this Halloween Eve. So, read by Lawrence R. Harvey, score by Chris Bozzoni, I believe. So, I don't know. Let's get it started. Let's try. Let's see what happens. I don't know. Hopefully there's nothing offensive or too crazy because I haven't listened to it. I was going to preview it, but, fuck it. Let's go for it. So, that's my chair squeaking, not me. So, let's listen together. The Vampire, A Tale. On record.
The Vampire by John Polidori. In the midst of a London winter, there appeared at the various gatherings of high society one Lord Ruthven, a nobleman more remarkable for his singularities than his rank. He gazed upon the mirth around him as if he could not participate therein. Apparently, the light laughter of the fair only attracted his attention that he might, by a look, quell it. His peculiarities caused him to be invited to every social occasion, in spite of the deadly hue of his face, though its form and outline were beautiful, and many women of loose virtue attempted to win his attentions, and perhaps gain some marks of affection. Lady Mercer, whose torrid affairs were an open secret amongst that class, virtually threw herself at him to no avail. But he was not indifferent to the female sex. Yet such was the caution with which he spoke to the virtuous wife and the innocent daughter that few ever knew of his interest. He had, however, the reputation of a winning tongue, and he was as often amongst those most virtuous of women as among the most notorious. About the same time there came to London a young gentleman of the name of Aubrey. He was an orphan left with an only sister in the possession of a great wealth by parents who died whilst he was yet in childhood. Left to his own devices by guardians who thought it their duty merely to take care of his fortune, he cultivated his imagination more than his judgment. Therefore, he held a highly romantic view of honour and candour. But upon entering into society circles, with its stratagems, lies, and flattery, he began to grow disenchanted. It was at this point that the paths of these two gentlemen crossed. Aubrey became fascinated, imagining the man as the hero of a romance. He took steps to become acquainted with him. He gradually learned that Lord Ruthven's affairs were embarrassed, and that he was about to depart for the continent. Desirous of gaining some insight into the singular character, he hinted to his guardians that it was time for him to perform the grand tour. They consented, and Aubrey, immediately mentioning his intentions to Ruthven, was surprised to receive an invitation to join him. Flattered by such a mark of esteem from him, who apparently had nothing in common with other men, he gladly accepted, and they set off within a few days. At Brussels and other towns through which they passed, Aubrey was surprised at the apparent eagerness with which his companion sought the centres of vice. There he entered into the spirit of the faro table. He always gambled with success, except when the known card sharper was his antagonist. And then he lost even more than he gained. But it was always with the same unchanging face with which he generally watched society around him. However, when he encountered the rash youth or luckless father of a numerous family, Then his apparent abstractness of mind disappeared, and his eyes sparkled like that of a cat toying with a half-dead mouse. In every town he left the formerly affluent youth in the solitude of a dungeon, cursing the fate that had led him to encounter this fiend, whilst many a father sat frantic amidst the pitiful looks of hungry children without a single penny to feed them. Yet he took no money from the gambling table, but immediately lost, to the ruin of many, the last guilder he had just snatched from the innocent. When they arrived in Rome, Aubrey for a time lost sight of his companion, leaving him daily amidst the circle of an Italian countess whilst he went in search of traces of antiquity. One day letters from him arrived. The first was from his sister, full of words of affection. The others were from his guardians, and this astonished him. If previously he had entertained the idea of any evil power in his companion, these letters seemed to lend credence to that. His guardians insisted upon his immediately leaving his friend, and urged that his character was vicious and heartless, for his possession of irresistible powers of seduction rendered his licentious habits more dangerous to society. It had been discovered that his spurning of the adulteress had not originated in displeasure at her character, but rather that his desires demanded that his victim should be cast from the pinnacle of virtue down to the lowest abyss of infamy and degradation. Apparently, on account of her virtue, had, since his departure, thrown aside any modesty or dignity to expose lives now deformed by vice. Aubrey resolved to find some pretext for abandoning him, but in the meanwhile he'd watch him even more closely. He entered into the same circle and soon realized that his lordship was endeavoring to work upon the inexperienced daughter of the lady whose house he chiefly frequented. In Italy, it is seldom that an unmarried female is met with in society. He was therefore obliged to carry on his plans in secret. But Aubrey's eye followed him in all his windings, and soon discovered that an assignation had been arranged, which would most likely end in the ruin of an innocent. Losing no time, he entered into the apartment of Lord Ruthven and asked him his intentions with respect to the lady. Lord Ruthven answered that his intentions were such as he supposed, and upon being pressed whether he intended to marry her, merely laughed. Aubrey retired, immediately writing a note to say that from that moment on he must decline accompanying his lordship in the remainder of their proposed tour. He ordered his servant to seek other apartments and called upon the mother of the lady, informed her of all he knew, not only with regard to her daughter, but also concerning the character of his lordship. The assignation was prevented. The next day, Lord Ruthven merely sent his servant to notify his agreement to a separation, but did not hint at any suspicion of his plans having been foiled by Aubrey's intervention. Having left Rome, Aubrey headed towards Greece and soon found himself at Athens. He then fixed his residence in the house of a Greek family and soon occupied himself in tracing the faded records of ancient glory that were written upon monuments and ruins. Under the same roof as himself, there existed the daughter of the household, a being so delicate and beautiful. The light step of Ianthe often accompanied Aubrey in his search for antiquities, and often would the girl engaged in the pursuit of a butterfly, he would say, display the beauty of her form to his gaze. It was an innocence, youth and beauty, unaffected by the crowded drawing rooms and stifling ball. Whilst he drew those traces of a past civilization, she would stand by and watch the magical effects of his pencil in tracing scenes of her native place. She would on occasion describe to him the circling folk dance upon the open plain, and would tell him all the supernatural tales of her nurse. Her earnestness and apparent belief in what she narrated excited the interest of Aubrey. and she told him of the tale of the living vampire who had passed years amongst his friends and dearest ties, forcing every year to prolong his existence by feeding upon the life of a lovely female. Aubrey attempted to laugh off such tales, but Ianthe cited to him the names of men who had discovered one living amongst themselves, after several of their near relatives and children had been found with the marks of the fiend's appetite. And when she still found him incredulous, she begged him to believe her, for it had been remarked that those who had dared question their existence were always provided with a terrible proof. She described to him the traditional appearance of these monsters, and a chill gripped his heart, as it was a pretty accurate description of Lord Ruthven. However, he persisted in trying to convince her that there could be no truth in her fears, but at the same time he wondered at the many coincidences which insinuated at the diabolical power of Lord Ruthven. Aubrey was enchanted by Ianthe. Her innocence won his heart, and while he ridiculed the idea of a young man of English habits marrying an uneducated Greek girl, still he found himself more and more attached to her. At times he would tear himself from her, and planning upon some antiquarian research, he would depart. But he always found it impossible to fix his attention upon the ruins around him. Ianthe was unconscious of his love, and was ever the same frank innocent he had first met. One day Aubrey determined to proceed upon one of his excursions, which was to detain him for a few hours. When Ianthe's parents heard the name of the place, they begged of him not to return at night, as he would have to pass through a wood which they described as the lair of the vampires, where they indulged in their nocturnal orgies, and warned him of evils that would befall anyone who dared to cross their path. Aubrey scoffed at the idea, but when he saw how grave their faces were, he went silent. The next morning, Aubrey prepared for his excursion unattended. He was surprised to observe the melancholy face of his host, and was concerned to find that his mocking of those horrible fiends had inspired within them such terror. When he was about to depart, Ianthe came to the side of his horse and earnestly begged him to return before night, and he assured her that he would. However, he was so preoccupied in his research that he did not notice the daylight fading, nor that on the horizon there was a storm brewing. At last he mounted his horse, determined to make up by speed for his delay, but it was too late. Twilight in these parts is almost unknown. Immediately the sun sets, night begins. And before he had gone far, the power of the storm was unleashed. Its thick, heavy rain forced its way through the foliage, whilst blue, forked lightning seemed to fall and radiate at his very feet. Suddenly his horse took fright, and he was carried with panicked rapidity through the entangled forest. The animal at last, through fatigue, stopped, and he found that he was in the neighbourhood of a hovel that barely emerged from the dead leaves and brushwood which surrounded it. Dismounting, he approached, hoping to find someone to guide him into town, or at least to obtain shelter from the storm. As he approached, a moment's silence alone in the storm allowed him to hear the dreadful shrieks of a woman mingling with the stifled, exultant mockery of a laugh. Startled, but roused by the thunder, which again rolled over his head, he forced open the door of the hut. He found himself in utter darkness, but the sound, which had continued, guided him. He came into contact with someone whom he immediately seized. However, he felt himself grappled by one whose strength seemed superhuman. He was lifted from his feet and hurled with enormous force against the ground. His enemy threw himself upon him, and kneeling upon his breast, had placed his hands upon his throat when the glare of approaching torches disturbed him. Instantly he rose and, leaving his prey, rushed through the door and made a break through the woods. Because the storm was now still, Aubrey was soon heard by those outside. As they entered, the light of the torches fell upon the mud walls, and at the urging of Aubrey they searched for her whose cries had alerted him. But what a tableau of horror the light of the torches revealed! the form of his fair Ianthe, now a lifeless corpse. There was no colour upon her cheek, not even upon her lip, but upon her neck and breast there was blood. And on her throat were the marks of teeth having opened the vein. The men pointed, crying with horror, "A vampire! A vampire!" A litter was quickly formed, and Aubrey was laid by the side of her who had lately been to him the object of so many sweet days. Now the flower of life had died within her. His mind took refuge in vacancy. Yet in his hand he held a naked dagger of a particular design, which had been found in the hut. They were soon met by different parties who had also been engaged in the search of the daughter whom a mother had missed. Their lamentable cries as they approached the city forewarned the parents of some dreadful catastrophe. To describe their grief would be impossible, but when they ascertained the cause of their child's death, they looked at Aubrey and pointed to the corpse. They were inconsolable. Both died broken-hearted. Aubrey, being put to bed, was seized by a most violent fever and was often delirious. In these intervals he would call upon Lord Ruthven and upon Ianthe. By some accountable combination he seemed to beg of his former companion to spare the being that he loved. At other times he would curse him as her destroyer. Lord Ruthven happened to arrive in Athens at this time, and, from whatever motive, upon hearing of the state of Aubrey, immediately placed himself in the same house, and became his constant attendant. When the latter recovered from his delirium, he was horrified and startled at the sight of a man whose image he had now combined with that of a vampire. But Lord Ruthven, by his kind words, implying almost repentance for the fault that had caused their separation, and still more by his attention, anxiety and care which he showed, soon reconciled him to his presence. His lordship seemed quite changed, except that at times he was surprised to meet his gaze fixed intently upon him, with a smile, malicious exultation playing on his lips. He knew not why, but this smile haunted him. Aubrey's mind was weakened, and that spirit which had once so distinguished him now seemed to have died. He was now as much a lover of solitude and silence as Lord Ruthven, but as much as he wished for solitude, his mind could not find it in the neighbourhood of Athens. If he sought it amidst the ruins he had formerly frequented, Ianthe's form stood by his side. If he sought it in the woods, her light step would appear wandering amidst the underwood. Then suddenly turning round, he would see, in his wild imagination, her pale face and wounded throat with a smile upon her lips. He determined to escape surroundings, every feature of which created such bitter associations in his mind. He proposed to Lord Ruthven, to whom he felt bound by the tender care he had taken of him during his illness, that they should visit those parts of Greece neither had yet seen. They travelled in every direction, yet they seemed not to heed what they gazed upon. They heard much of robbers and bandits, but they gradually began to dismiss these reports, which they thought were only the invention of those whose interest it was to encourage the generosity of those whom they defended from imaginary dangers. In consequence for neglecting the advice of locals, on one occasion they travelled with only a few guards, more to serve as guides than as a defence. However, upon entering the narrow gorge, with masses of rocks brought down from neighbouring cliffs, they had reason to regret their negligence, for scarcely were the party within the narrow pass when they were startled by the whistling of bullets close to their heads and by the report of several guns. In an instant, the guards had left them, and placing themselves behind rocks had begun to fire in the direction whence the shots came. Lord Ruthven and Aubrey, following their example, hid behind the sheltering turn of the gorge, but ashamed of thus being detained by a foe who mockingly bade them advance, and being exposed if any of the robbers should climb above them and take them from the rear, they decided to charge towards the enemy. That's when Lord Ruthven received a shot in the shoulder, which brought him to the ground. Aubrey hastened to his assistance, and no longer paying attention to the peril around him, was soon surrounded by the robbers. His guards, having, upon Lord Ruthven's being wounded, immediately surrendered. By promises of financial reward, Aubrey induced them to convey his wounded companion to a nearby cabin, and having agreed upon a ransom, he was no more disturbed by their presence, they being merely content to guard the entrance until their comrade should return with the promised sum. Lord Ruthven's strength rapidly decreased. In 2 days, mortification ensued, and death grew near. His conduct and appearance had not changed, but towards the close of the final evening his mind became uneasy, and his eye often fixed upon Aubrey, who was induced to offer his assistance with more than usual earnest. "Assist me? You may save me. You've made more than that. I hate the death of my existence as little as that of the passing day. But you may save my honor, your friend's honor." "How? Tell me how. I would do anything," replied Aubrey. "I need but little. My life ebbs apace. I cannot explain the whole, but if you would hold in confidence all you know of me, so that my honor were free from stain, and if my death remained a secret for some time in England." "Swear it!" cried the dying man, raising himself with exultant violence. "Swear by all you hold dear. Swear that for a year and a day you will not impart your knowledge of my crimes or death to any living being, whatever may happen, whatever you may see." "I swear," said Aubrey. Lord Ruthven sunk, laughing, upon his pillow, and breathed no more.
End side 1. Gotta flip it.
Aubrey retired, but did not sleep. The many circumstances concerning his acquaintance with this man weighed upon his mind. And when he remembered his oath, a cold shivering came over him, as if from the presentiment of something horrible awaiting him. Rising early in the morning, he was about to enter the hovel in which he had left the corpse, when a robber informed him that it was no longer there. It having been carried by himself and his comrades to a neighbouring hilltop, according to a promise they had given his lordship, that his corpse should be exposed to the first ray of the moon that rose after his death. Aubrey, astonished, taking several of the men, determined to go and bury it upon the spot where it lay. But when he had climbed the summit, he found neither the body nor the clothes, though the robbers pointed out the very slab on which they had lain the body. Weary of a country in which he had met with such terrible misfortunes, and in which everything seemingly conspired to feed the superstitious melancholy that had taken hold of his mind, he resolved to depart, and soon arrived at the Aegean coast. While waiting for a vessel to convey him to Naples, he occupied himself in arranging those effects he had with him belonging to Lord Ruthven. Amongst other things, there was a case containing several daggers and knives. Whilst examining them, he was surprised at a sheath apparently ornamented in the same style as the dagger that he discovered in the hut in the woods. You can imagine his horror when he discovered that it fitted the sheath perfectly. Still, he wished not to believe it, but that peculiar form, the same design, the varying tints on the haft and sheath were alike, and what left no room for doubt were the drops of blood on both. On his journey home, he inquired in Rome about the lady he had saved from Lord Ruthven's seductive arts. Her parents were in distress, their fortune ruined, and she had not been heard of since the departure of his lordship. Aubrey's mind became almost broken under the repeated horrors. He was afraid that this lady had fallen a victim to the destroyer of Ianthe. He became morose and silent, and his only occupation consisted in urging the speed of the carriage, as if he were going to save the life of someone he held dear. He arrived at Calais and then to the English shores, and he hastened to his family estate, and there, for a moment, appeared to lose in the embrace of his sister all memory of the past. Miss Aubrey had not that winning grace which gains the gaze and applause of drawing-room society. There was none of that light brilliancy which only exists in the heated atmosphere of a crowded apartment. Her blue eyes were never lit up by the levity of the mind beneath. There was a melancholy charm about it which did not seem to arise from misfortune, but from some feeling within. When alone, her face was never brightened by the smile of joy, but when her brother whispered to her of his affection, and would, in her presence, forget those griefs that she knew tortured his mind, who would have exchanged her smile for any other? She was yet only 18, and had not been presented to the world, it having been thought by her guardians more fit that her presentation should be delayed until her brother's return from the continent, when he might act as her protector. It was now, therefore, resolved that the next drawing-room soiree, which was fast approaching, should be her entry into society circles. Aubrey would rather have remained in the family mansion, alone with the melancholy which overpowered him. He could not feign interest in the frivolities of fashionable strangers, when his mind had been so torn by the events to which he had been party. But he determined to sacrifice his own comfort to the protection of his sister. They soon arrived in town and prepared for the party the next day. The gathering was large. A soiree like this had not been held for a long time, and all of high society came out to bask in the smile of royalty. Aubrey was there with his sister. While sitting in a corner by himself, he recalled that the first time he had seen Lord Ruthven was in that very place. He felt himself seized by the arm, and a voice he recognized all too well sounded in his ear. "Remember your oath." Fearful, he perceived at a little distance the figure which attracted his notice upon his first entry into society. He was overcome with a sense of terror and forced his way through the crowd into his carriage and was driven home. He rapidly paced back and forth, and his mind floundering amid the circumstances of the dagger, the proof of Ruthven's crime, his oath to a dying man. Seeing Lord Ruthven again before him, he could not believe that it possible that the dead rise again. He reasoned that his imagination had led him to misrecognize the stranger. It was impossible that it could really be his travelling companion. Therefore, he decided to go again into society to attempt to discern more about Lord Ruthven. A few nights later, he went with his sister to the assembly at the home of a relative. Leaving her under the protection of a matron, he retired into a recess, and there he became lost in his own thoughts. Perceiving at last that people were leaving, he roused himself, and entering into another room, found his sister surrounded by attendees, apparently in earnest conversation. He attempted to work his way through the crowd to her, when a man whom he requested to move turned round and revealed to him that face which he most abhorred. He sprang forward, seized his sister's arm, and hurriedly steered her towards the street. At the door, he found himself impeded by the crowd of servants, and whilst working his way through them, he again heard that voice whisper close to him, "Remember your oath." He did not dare turn, but hurrying his sister soon reached home. Now that the certainty of the monster's existence again consumed his thoughts, his sister's attentions went unheeded, and it was in vain that she entreated him to explain what had caused his abrupt conduct. He only uttered a few words, and those terrified her. The more he thought, the more the implications of his oath sickened him. Was he to allow this monster to roam, burning ruin upon all he held dear? His very sister might have been touched by him. But even if he were to break his oath and disclose his suspicions, who would believe him? He thought of killing the fiend to free the world from such a wretch, but death held no finality for this devil. For days he remained in this state, shut up in his room. He saw no one and ate only when his sister came, who, with tears streaming from her eyes, besought him for her sake to return to his sense. At last, no longer capable of bearing solitude, he left his house and roamed from street to street, anxious to flee the thoughts which besieged him. At first he returned home each evening, but at last he laid down to rest wherever fatigue overtook him. His dress became neglected, and he wandered, exposed to the noonday sun and the midnight damp. He was no longer to be recognized. Suddenly one day his conduct changed, as he was struck with the idea that by his absence he had laid his friends and acquaintances exposed to the fiend amongst them. He determined to enter into society again and watch closely, anxious to forewarn all whom Lord Ruthven approached with intimacy, in spite of his oath. But his haggard and suspicious looks were so striking to polite society that his sister was at last obliged to beg him for her sake to abstain from attending those gatherings that had affected him so strongly. When, however, her remonstrance proved unavailing, the guardians thought it time to resume that trust which had been imposed upon them by Aubrey's parents. Desirous of saving him from the sufferings he had encountered in his wandering, and of preventing him from exposing to the eyes of polite society what they considered to be signs of madness, they engaged a physician to reside in the house and take constant care of him. He hardly appeared to notice. So completely was his mind absorbed by one terrible subject. His incoherence became so great that he was confined to his chamber. There he would often lie for days, incapable of being roused. He had become emaciated. His eyes had attained a glassy lustre. The only sign of his former self that remained showed itself upon the entry of his sister. Then he would start, seizing her hands, and with a look that severely affected her, he would ask her not to touch him. "Oh, do not touch him. If you truly care about me, do not go near him." When she inquired to whom he referred, his only answer was, True, yeah." And again he sank into listlessness, from which even she could not rouse him. This lasted many months. Gradually, however, as the year wore on, his incoherence became less frequent, and his mind cleared a little of its gloom. Whilst his guardians observed that several times a day he would count upon his fingers and then smile to himself. The time had nearly elapsed, when, upon the last day of the year, one of the guardians, entering his room, began to converse with the physician upon the tragic circumstance of Aubrey being in so awful a state when his sister was going to be married the next day. Instantly, Aubrey's attention was focused. He asked anxiously to whom. Glad of this sign of returning faculties, they mentioned the name of the Earl of Marsden. Believing this to be a young earl whom he had met with in society, Aubrey seemed pleased and expressed his intention to be present at the nuptials and see his sister. Alas, they said no. but in a few minutes his sister was with him. Apparently he was again capable of being affected by her lovely smile, for he pressed her to his breast and kissed her cheek, wet with tears flowing at the thought of her brother being once more returned to his senses. He began to speak with warmth and to congratulate her upon her marriage when he noticed a locket upon her breast. Opening it, he beheld the features of the monster who had for so long influenced his life. He seized the portrait in a rage and trampled it underfoot. Upon asking him why he had destroyed the image of her future husband, he looked uncomprehendingly at her. Then clasping her hands and gazing at her with a frantic expression of desperation, he bade her swear that she would never wed this monster, but he could not say any more. It seemed as if that voice again bade him to remember his oath. He suddenly turned round, thinking Lord Ruthven was near, but saw no one. In the meantime, the guardians and physician who had witnessed all thought this was a return of the disorder, and separated him from Miss Aubrey. He fell upon his knees and implored them to delay the nuptials for a single day more. This they saw as a relapse to the insanity they imagined had taken possession of his mind, and they retired. Lord Ruthven had called the morning after the Aubreys' hasty departure from the drawing-room soiree. When he heard of the young man's ill health, he understood himself to be the cause of it. But when he learned that he was deemed to have gone insane, his triumphant pleasure could not be concealed. He hastened to the house of his former companion, and, by constant attendance and the pretence of great affection for the young man and interest in his fate, he gradually won the affection of Miss Aubrey. Who could resist his power? His dangerous tongue span its web of silken lies, fortifying her affections over the months that passed, gaining her trust in him, until the time when familial duties required he accept an important position at a European embassy, which served as an excuse for hastening the marriage, in spite of her brother's deranged state, which was to take place the very day before his departure for the continent. Night passed without rest for the busy inhabitants of the house, and Aubrey heard with horror the notes of busy preparation. Morning came, and the sound of carriages broke upon the ear. Aubrey grew almost frantic. The curiosity of the servants overcame their vigilance at last, and they gradually stole away, leaving him in the custody of a helpless old woman. He seized the opportunity, and with one bound was out of the room, and in a moment found himself in the next apartment, where all were neatly assembled. Lord Ruthven was the first to see him, and immediately approached. Taking him on by force, hurried him from the room, speechless with rage. When on the staircase, Lord Ruthven whispered in his ear, "Remember your oath, and know if not my bride today, your sister will be dishonoured." So saying, he pushed him towards the attendants, who, alerted by the old woman, had come in search of him. Aubrey could no longer support himself. His rage, not finding vent, had broken a blood vessel, and he was conveyed to bed. This was not mentioned to his sister, who was not present when he entered, as the physician was afraid of agitating her and ruining this, her special day. The marriage was conducted, and the bride and bridegroom left London. Aubrey's weakness increased. The internal bleeding produced symptoms of the near approach of death. He pleaded for his sister's guardians to be called, and when the midnight hour struck, released from his oath, he related the narrative of the events we have just followed to his audience, who grew equally in knowledge as to the reasons behind the events of the past year and to the intrigues of the fiend that they had embraced. He died immediately after concluding his account. The guardians hasted to protect Miss Aubrey, but when they arrived, it was too late. Lord Ruthven had disappeared. Aubrey's sister lay lifeless, having slaked the thirst of a vampire.
Well, that concludes story time, kids. Thanks for joining us. That was fun. And happy Halloween. Thank you. Have a good one.